is also as a child of empire. But, in recent months, we've seen the issue of slavery and colonialism expand beyond campuses, as we've now got, of course, from Barbados to Jamaica, prominent Caribbeans also calling for Britain to pay reparations for slavery and the consequences of colonialism. And, Madam Speaker, were we engaged in this debate in 1807 or 1833, I likely would have crossed the floor to support the motion opposite, because, of course, the victims of the horrendous horrors of slavery would have been alive and deserving of damages. But it's not 1807, it's not 1907, it's not even 2007. Over 2 centuries have passed since Britain led the world as the first empire in history to abolish slavery, and the right of reparations died long ago, because reparations are fundamentally about matters of tort law. The purposes of damages, reparation, is to restore the victim, the slave, to the position they were in before the damage occurred, slavery. The actual victim only can receive damages, not their descendants. And therein lies the rub, because some 6 or 7 generations separate those alive today from their British Empire slave ancestors. And whilst not just yet, thank you so much. Whilst it's undeniable that 19th century slaves suffered unspeakable horrors, in what way can this lead one to conclude that their great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren are also victims and deserving of reparations too? On the contrary, from Britain to the Caribbean, the descendants of slaves today have a far better and higher quality of life than they would have had their ancestors remained in Africa. And that's an indisputable fact. Well, if you let me carry on, I'll tell you why.
Hello guys, welcome back to the channel. I just hope that you're doing fine made for you today. This is Eugene Doc Stories and yet with another video. So for the longest time, the question of reparation being paid, and I know people from the Black community in general, we have always talked about being reparated. But now let's get back to the Britain. Let's go to Britain. Now there's this guy arguing that Black people should not pay reparations for slavery or colonialism, and it's called Rev Adel Manco. This is a commentator and author. He has been featured in different writings and a number of things. Now in this debate, he argues that generally white people should not pay reparations to Africans and people with African descent. I'm talking about Black people in general. That's an umbrella term. Black people, it's an umbrella term, right? Because we have people who don't want to identify as Black. Some identify as Hebrew, some identify as a foundational Black American, some identify as African descendants of slavery, so slave trade, so amongst other things. So Black is just an umbrella term. Now we know that for the longest time, amongst other groups also that have been enslaved, because we have people who are saying that not only Black people were enslaved, but other people were also enslaved, other groups of people. Now this gentleman argues that Africans or people with Black descent or people with African descent don't deserve reparations, because one, his argument is based on they don't owe Black people anything. Two, another form of his argument is that slavery happened long time ago. And the third argument that he gives is also we also have Africans who enslaved fellow Africans. We have Africans who did much number of things. We have Arabs who also enslaved Africans more than the Britain or the US, which did to Black people. So I just want you to hear his opinion in regards to this, because I know this is a point where, we've seen people coming out trying to talk about this, but I just want you to hear what he says, and I'll come back and say, to me, why I think Black people, we deserve reparation, or if not all Black people, but at least people who deserve to be reparated needs the reparation. So let's dive right into the video. And if you're watching this video for the first time, I'll ask you to subscribe to the channel, like the video, so that people who are like-minded like you can get to see how people think about this issue of reparation. because the issue of colonialism, which happened in Africa, and slave trade, which happened in both in Africa and the United States and other parts of the world, including the United Kingdom, Brazil, all those places. So let's dive right into the video, and I'll come back with my commentary, trying to tell you why, for me, I think that Africans, people with African descent, or black people in general, deserves to be liberated. Until then, let's dive right into the video.
Well, first I ask you, is a current descendant of a slave ethically entitled to benefit from their ancestors' sufferings? And who should pay? Is it ethical for an innocent person today to be culpable for the sins of their forefathers? Now, CARICOM, which is the Caribbean body calling for reparations, wants British taxpayers to pay. But why? Out of a population of millions, there were only 3,000 slave owners in Britain. The vast majority of the population of Britain descend from people whose lives were one of abject poverty and hardship, working in hellish conditions akin to serfdom. Why should they, as taxpayers, pay reparations? It's not just yet. Thank you so much. 16% of the British population is now also foreign-born, so why should they pay for reparations? What about the descendants of slaves living in Britain today? Why should people from Trinidad and Tobago living here pay reparations to people in Jamaica? Then again, why is the demand for reparations always focused and framed in terms of Britain? Why are no activists asking for reparations from the African states that were equally complicit in slavery? Should they not pay reparations? They provided the slaves that were transferred over the ocean, and millions more slaves were kept in slavery in Africa by other Africans, just as were being transported across the Atlantic. Why does nobody ever actually speak about that unpleasant truth? What about the Arabs and the Muslims who bought and sold African slaves for centuries before the British arrived and continued to do so into the 20th century until the British and the French tried to stop it? And indeed, what about the slavery that carries on today? The International Labour Organization says that currently approximately 7 in every 1,000 Africans is a slave. 10 million people. In 2017, CNN reported hundreds of slaves are sold every week in Libya. So much energy is given to historic reparation and the historic plight of slaves. I would have more time for the argument if the people actively pursuing that course of action were equally vocal about surely the far more horrendous plight of slaves today, where there are more slaves today in bondage, in slavery, than crossed over the Atlantic. So where are the protests outside the Nigerian High Commission? Where are the protests outside the embassies of Niger, which has 800,000 slaves today? What about Mali and Chad and Sudan and Cameroon? It's almost as if there's an ulterior motivation behind the call for apologies and reparations exclusively from Britain. And how far should we... No, I would love to, and normally I would, maybe a bit later on, but I'm getting into the swing of things now. And how far should we take this? Should Britain seek reparations for the Barbary slaves? 1 million Europeans, at the same time as Africans were going over the Atlantic, 1 million Europeans were enslaved by the Ottoman states of Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia. And it carried on after the abolition of the slave trade by the British. Should Britain demand reparations from North Africa? Of course not. It's time to move on, and so should we. But let's turn away from slavery and expand our view to colonialism more broadly. What disadvantage has colonialism actually caused to those living in the former British colonies of the Caribbean? And disadvantage compared to whom? And this is to go back to the point that you asked. Most of the former colonies of the Caribbean are now successful middle-income countries. The GDP per head of the Bahamas is higher than Portugal and is comparable to Spain and Italy. You never hear that, do you? Barbados, Antigua and Barbuda, St. Kitts and Nevis, and other former British slave colonies have higher rankings on the UN's Human Development Index than Brazil, Mexico, or many other Spanish-speaking South American countries. How has the British Empire disadvantaged the Caribbean nations? It's not clear to me. But let's test this further, and let's go and look and compare the nations of the Caribbean with modern West Africa, the original homelands of Caribbean slaves. to see what life is like there. GDP per capita in Benin is $1,430. In Barbados, it's $17,000, over 10 times higher. Life expectancy in Benin is 62, in Barbados it is 79. Rather than writing checks to well-off areas of the world, why not focus on countries and areas that are actually impoverished and require aid? Financial aid not attached to alleged attempts to cleanse one's soul. It can't be clearer. While slavery was abhorrent for those who were enslaved, had they stayed in Africa, the lives of their descendants today would be unquestionably worse. So what exactly, actually, is Britain being asked to pay reparations for? Because Britain wasn't the first empire in Africa, in India, in the Americas, but it was the most benign, and the benefits from it far exceed those, for example, of the Islamic and Indian empires that carved up India, of the Ashanti Empire, of the Dahomey Kingdom, and all of the hundreds and thousands of slaves that were ritually sacrificed every year in Benin. And the Benin Bronzes were mentioned. The Benin Bronzes commemorates those who actually owned slaves. So whilst on the one hand I can understand why you would protest Coulston's statue, why is there a celebration of the Benin Bronzes when they also commemorate slave owners? Yes, please.
How do you account for things like the racialized wealth gap in Britain today and for the fact that England did pay reparations, but they paid it to slave owners to the tune of $21 billion by current estimations?
And I find this argument very interesting. 40%, you're quite right, 40% of the budget was spent on freeing the slaves by paying off their owners. But the practical reality was the abolition of the slave trade would never have happened had it not been for that. Because of those 3,000 slave owners, for many of them, that was their only source of income and investment. And it would never have passed through Parliament. No, but one has to be factual and practical. If you want to abolish slavery, one has to compromise, and that was how it was done. The slave trade didn't fuel the Industrial Revolution. The slave trade was abolished far too early. Only 5% of GDP was allied with the slave trade. So why are we apologizing for Britain? Are we apologizing to Britain for introducing nutrition and food storage policies that led to a decline in the subcontinent's processes of famine that happened every 40 years? In India there was a famine. The population of India soared from 170 million to 450 million over the course of the Raj because of medicine, health, and accurate and proper nutritional standards and food storage compared to how it had been. There had never been in history of India such a surge in population growth. And let's not forget also what Britain did for women's rights, because I think it's fair to say that it's thanks to the British Empire that we have had the progression of women in Africa and India through society. Because, of course, India's history is one of female oppression. It was the British who abolished suttee, the burning of widows on the funeral pyre of their husbands. It was the British that stopped the infanticide of young girls. And it was the British who allowed Hindu widows to remarry. I'm sorry if you don't like the facts, but facts are actually facts. Universities were brought into Africa and India by the British. It's quite... There would be no system of democratic legislatures within these regions. As Steven Pinker has written, pre-state societies before the British Empire arrived were on average far more violent than even the most brutal of modern states. So whilst many wrongs were committed in the 19th and 20th centuries, the modern success of Britain's former colonies today in the 21st century is due in large part to their colonial inheritance. The English language and the common law that enabled them to become global players, their civic institutions, the police, the military, the civil service, the judiciary, parliament, universities, every region of the world you go to, British colonies are the ones most likely to be the most developed, the wealthiest, and the most democratic. I therefore have no opposition in opposing tonight's motion, but I'd like to end by quoting the great black civil rights activist and socialist Bayard Rustin, a friend of Martin Luther King Jr.'s and posthumous recipient of the Presidential Medal of Freedom from Barack Obama, who said, "If my great-grandfather picked cotton for 50 years, then he may deserve some money, but he's dead and gone. and nobody owes me anything. Thank you.
Hello guys, welcome back to the channel. I hope that you're fine wherever you are today. As I know, this topic is really multi-faced and we have different groups of people and people identify different ways. We have people who identify as Black Americans. We have people who want to be called African Americans. We have Black people who don't want to be called African Americans, which is okay. We have Black people who identify themselves as African descendants of slave trade, which are also part of the African descent. Now, all in all, every Black person has experienced the wrath of slavery and its effect today. Black people in the United States will tell you they have experienced the Jim Crow, what is today we call the discrimination, which has happened to Black people. However, one reason as to why I will say that Black people still need to be reparated, it's one, the systems in which Black people still live. And this is my argument, right? The systems which Black people still live, it is still corrupted to discriminate a Black person. It might not be directly, but its effects are still there, you know. Referencing from what should be done and what should not be done, it is that you know, we have historical injustice. Historical injustices really happened to Black people, people who have experienced these things. And you have people who are suffering from post-traumatic syndrome, you know, and these happen because of the type of life that they were exposed to. People are really stressed, you know, because of these. People are really having problems with everything that they are seeing happening in their community and things that that their forefathers went through. So I'll base my argument from the historical justice, you know. Somebody will say that, you know, why do you want us to pay for reparation, yet we are from this generation? And I'll answer you like this. One thing, you might not know, or you know, that you are benefiting from the structures, from the racial structures, from the discriminating structures that have been put to benefit you. Like, for instance, if you're in the United States and you're a white person, most definitely, chances are that you are enjoying white privilege. It's either you know it or you don't know, which Black people are not enjoying the same privilege that you are enjoying. So, this is something that really happens. Another point of argument is the wealth disparities. We have a large wealth disparities between Black people and white people, especially in the United States. Also, these might not be same with people in Africa because it's a different story, but kind of, you know, the parallelism between them, because when Black people in the United States were going through, you know, slavery and all those things, Africans back in Africa, they were facing colonialism. Also, at the same time, slavery from their leaders who sold some of Africans, you know, what is called pioneering. They sold them to debtors and everything. They also owned slaves as part of argument that this gentleman was trying to give. Of course, this topic is really multifaceted. That's why I began by saying that, and I recognize that it is intertwined, that you need critical thinking to unravel everything. So just saying, you know, the wealth disparities because of the legacy of slavery, which has caused to Black people, these has created enormous wealth for white people. And as you usually know, it is the Black people that built the United States. They worked, they provided free labor, they were never paid for it, you know, they were enslaved to work. And even if people came out with ways of, you know, removing the slavery, from people from the southern parts came up with what is called the Black Code. These Black Codes still enslaved Africans. So enslaved Africans in the United States during those times, or Black people in the United States, or people who identify as Hebrew, or people, different groups of people, especially when you are Black. they could experience this, right? So wealth disparities is some amongst things that if somebody really asks me, I'll talk about. I'll also talk about systemic inequalities, even talking about wealth disparities, reparations can just act as a way of could just act as a way of, you know, just telling you I'm sorry. Because I know sometimes you have the guilt, seeing yourself under the wealth, generational wealth that you've been acquiring from your great grandparents, from your grandfather, from your father, and then now you are acquiring it. Might you not feel guilty about it? For me, I think if I was a white person, I could have felt really guilty about it. So also systemic inequalities, amongst other things that are really being addressed in this topic. Also, the system that perpetuated racial inequalities such as housing discrimination, educational disparities, and mass incarceration are rooted in the past but continue to impact the present. Reparation could be a way to address and rectify these ongoing systemic issues. And I know. Now, another also important talking point. Now, if the gentleman argued that Africans also enslaved Africans, Arabs also enslaved Africans even more than what the UK and the US did to Africans, right? Now, this is my point on this. What Africans, because I know it was not all Africans, and I'm not trying to defend Africans for doing this. It's uncalled for, it's bad, right? So the African leaders, like kingdoms like Dahomey, who used to sell slaves so much as compared to any other group, what we can do is first repatriation. Repatriation only to black people in the United States or in the UK who want to come back to Africa. Repatriation. If it could have been possible, I'm talking about a perfect society. I don't know if it's possible, but repatriation could be a given way for Africans themselves to say sorry, to say that we recognize what some of our ancestors did to you, and we are really sorry. Because I know even slaves, African slaves were taken from Africa. Some also had families in Africa, and the ties are still there. Maybe they just don't know. But if that's why people look at their DNA. That's why when you look at your DNA, you got to find that you are Moroccan, you are Ghanaian, you are Nigerian, you are, mostly in the western parts of Africa, right? So because in the eastern part, it was more influenced by these Arabs, the eastern part of it mostly. So the western part is where a large number of African slaves were taken. So that being said, it means that reparation is still something that needs to be talked about, needs to be discussed in deeper lenses, and we really need to know what's really happening in the world. And that's what I could say about that. I'll let this chance to let you know. If you have anything to say about it, you can add in the comment section. We can talk about this, and I'm ready to engage in a conversation in regards to this. You can tell me what you think. You can tell me what the person who was debating against the question of reparation, if black people should be reparated, is a matter of something that we can really want to talk about. And I hope to also hear your 2 cents in regards to this. Until then, you usually know this is your presenter, Eugene Talk Stories, and let's meet on my next video. Until then, peace, love, and reparations.